Hello everyone, Phoenix Knight here. Welcome to the channel, and welcome to a new video on the channel. After we failed to defeat Voldemort last week in Harry Potter Death Eaters Rising, we're going to take a little bit of a break from gameplay. Normally I have game playthroughs or product unboxings on the channel, and over the course of the weekend I do have a product unboxing that I'm getting ready to make, but I'm not going to spoil what that is. Anyway, today we're going to make a very different video. So Fantasy Flight has now come out with 3 living card games: Arkham Horror, Lord of the Rings, and Marvel Champions. Let's say you're looking at these 3 card games, but you only have the resources to get into one of them, which is a fair concern because with all 3 of these being living card games, they're, theoretically anyway, coming out with new content constantly. Hopefully this video will help you to make the decision about which game, or potentially games, to get into. My experience levels with these 3 games are vastly different. As you probably know, I've featured multiple Arkham Horror campaigns on the channel. I've featured multiple campaigns for Arkham Horror, the card game, and I've got more coming on the channel. So I'm definitely all in on that game. I've played Lord of the Rings off camera a few times. I wasn't all that impressed by that though, and I'll talk more about why that is during this review video. But I'll explain more about what I'm planning on doing in this video later. Marvel Champions was an interesting experience for me. I started off not being all that impressed with Marvel Champions. I just was kind of like, initially at first. And I think a lot of that came from the Marvel theme and not being a huge fan of that to begin with. But I have warmed up considerably to Marvel Champions, and now I'm all in on that as well. And I'll talk a little more about why I'm all in on Marvel Champions as well. But anyway, in this video we're going to talk about 5 main points with each game. We're going to talk about the basic intro of the theme. We'll talk about how rounded each game works, the deck building, the campaign structure, and how easy each game is to expand. With that, let's start out with the themes, and we'll start with Arkham Horror. Like all of the games in the Arkham Horror files, in Arkham Horror the Living Card game, you take on the role of an investigator, or team of investigators, investigating the strange goings-on of the Cthulhu mythos. Typically the game is set in Arkham, Massachusetts, but that varies depending on what campaign you're playing and what scenario within that campaign, or potentially a side story you're playing. I'll talk a little more about side stories when we get into the campaign structures and ease of expanding. For now, file that away as they exist. Anyway, that will do it for Arkham Horror. Now let's move into the theme for Lord of the Rings. In Lord of the Rings LCG, you take on the role of 3 heroes in the Lord of the Rings universe to go on a series of quests in Middle-earth. Similarly to Arkham Horror, you might also be able to throw in side stories into your campaign. Again though, I'll mention those a little bit more when we get back to campaign structures and ease of expanding. Anyway, that will do it for Lord of the Rings. Now let's talk about the theme for Marvel Champions. In Marvel Champions, you take on the role of heroes in the Marvel comic universe, taking on villains of the same. There isn't really a defined setting per se, but it's basically a comic-enhanced version of a big city. Think New York City. You'll get the idea from that. Your ultimate goal there is to defeat the villains before they complete their main scheme. And there are several playthroughs out on YouTube. I might actually feature Marvel Champions on the channel, considering how I've warmed up to it. But anyway, that's all 3 of the themes. So which theme ultimately appeals to you is your call. So there's really no point in passing judgment on any of these games based on the theme. So as I mentioned, that's the theme. Now let's take a look at how around each of these games works. And once again, we'll go first to Arkham Horror. There are 4 phases in the round for Arkham Horror, the card game. First up is the Mythos phase, which is admittedly a bit weird for people who play the other games in the files and are used to having the Mythos phase at the end. Anyway, that musing aside, the Mythos phase is the game doing bad things trying to advance the agenda of the forces of darkness, which you actually skip the minor detail aside. I think part of the confusion on that comes from the fact that you actually skip the Mythos phase in the first round, because your scenario setup actually takes the place of the Mythos phase for the first round, whereas you jump into it like normal. But in the official in the official configuration of the round, the Mythos phase is actually the first phase of the round, so you do have to be careful about anything you do there means the card isn't available. If you say you exhaust a card in the Mythos phase, it isn't available until the end of the round. So that does take a little getting used to. But anyway, after that is the investigation phase, where we're trying to the investigation phase where we're trying to advance our agenda. This is also known interchangeably as the action phase unofficially, because it's also where the investigators do their thing. Next up is the enemy phase, where any enemies who have come out to cause havoc with us. Say that 5 times fast. And then finally we have the upkeep phase, where everything resets, along with each investigator gaining a resource and drawing a card. Our goal here is to advance through the Act deck before the game gets through the Agenda deck. You can see more about that in the playthrough I've linked in the description down below. Anyway, that will do it for the round in Arkham Horror. Now let's move to Lord of the Rings. Unlike in Arkham Horror, Lord of the Rings LCG has 7 phases in its round. First up is the resource phase, where every hero gains resources and draws cards. Next up is the planning phase, where the players play out items, or other allies, and things like that. You pay resources to do that, but I'll explain more about that when we get into the deck building. The third phase is the quest phase, where you commit characters to the active quest, draw and counter cards, some of which might go to the staging area, and others which will cause immediate problems in the form of events, and finally resolve the quest for the round based on the difference between willpower and threat in the staging area. The fourth phase is the travel phase, where the heroes can travel to a new location if they don't have an active location. In the fifth phase, the encounter phase brings the enemies face to face with the players depending on threat levels. The sixth phase, the combat phase, has the enemies and players fighting each other. Finally, the seventh phase, the refresh phase, essentially resets everything for the coming round. That is a very long round. Now let's go through what I think is the simplest round of the 3 for a Marvel Champions round. Of the 3, I would say that the round in Marvel Champions is probably the simplest and most streamlined. First, you have the hero phase, where the heroes continue their fight against the villains by playing their cards, attacking the villain and their minions, and thwarting any of the various schemes that are in play. They can also request actions on each other, but that gets more into the teamwork aspect of the game. But after the heroes have taken their turns, the villain will then take its turn, where it attacks or schemes against each hero depending on what form they're in. The villain will attack if you're in hero form versus scheme if you're in alter ego form. Scheming is how threat gets up to the schemes for the most part, but there are other ways, of course, that threat can get up to the scheme. And as part of the villain phase, you also have cards from the encounter deck, and this can get out of control in a hurry. Anyway, basically that fight is the goal of that game is just, it's basically an all-out beat them before they beat you kind of. Ultimately that's kind of the fight of how everything works. But anyway, so we've talked about the theme and how a round works. But what about how we play the game? Namely, what we're doing on the side of good. That brings us to the deck building for each game. So once again, let's move to Arkham Horror. The Arkham Horror files feature 50-something investigators, 46 of which have come into the card game as investigators. And while there is definitely some homogenization within each class, each of their unique special abilities make the investigators feel different. For example, while there are definitely some mystic staples that both of these investigators would use, looking at their special abilities, they work differently, so the final build would definitely feel different based on that. Additionally, Fantasy Flight has managed to make each investigator build their decks very differently. So the way you do that is there are 6 classes of cards: Guardian, Mystic, Survivor, Seeker, Neutral, and Rogue, ranging in levels from 0 to 5. So using these cards, based on each investigator's individual deck building restrictions, you'll initially build and then upgrade the deck over the course of the campaign, and we'll come back to this when we talk about the campaign structure. In my view, the deck building for Arkham Horror is probably the most involved of the 3, and a lot of that probably comes from the campaign structure, but once again, more on that later. Anyway, that's Arkham Horror deck building. Now let's move over to Lord of the Rings. Unlike in Arkham Horror, in Lord of the Rings, you build around the heroes and their spheres of influence, which you can see down here in the lower left corner of each card. You do need to be careful, though, because in Lord of the Rings, you can only use resources from a hero's sphere of influence to pay for a card. For instance, if you build around a mix of lore and spirit, which I believe are these two in some combination, I think this is lore, this is spirit, if I remember correctly, you can't use resources from a lore pool to pay for a spirit card. So you do need to be careful on that regard. Arkham Horror is a little simpler in that way, since each investigator has a pool of resources that they use to pay for their cards. And from what I'm seeing in Lord of the Rings, the decks can either change not much or radically depending on what scenario you're heading into. Again, we'll talk about that more when we visit the campaign structure. But anyway, that will do it for Lord of the Rings. Now we'll visit the deck building in Marvel Champions. Custom decks in Marvel Champions need to be between 40 and 50 cards, including the hero cards with the chosen identity. So say you're building like a custom Spider-Man deck, you'd have your, I think it's like 10 to 15 cards from Spider-Man. Then you can build from usually one aspect with that, but yeah, you'll focus on one aspect from that. Unlike in Arkham Horror or Lord of the Rings, where decks can focus on multiple classes or spheres. I probably won't do too much with the deck building for Marvel Champions. I expect I'll keep the decks together if I expect to play this game how I expect to. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. But anyway, I spent a bit of time in this video alluding to the campaign structures for these games, so I think that will serve as a good segue to the next bullet point in this video, which is the campaign structures. Let's start with what, in my view, is probably the best campaign structure in Arkham Horror. I probably should have mentioned this earlier in the video, but you might be able to tell I'm not, biased. I don't think is the word I want, but it's probably the only one that can work at a glance. But anyway, I am somewhat biased toward Arkham Horror, but I'm trying to be as objective as I can in this video. But anyway, all three campaigns are similar in that you play a scenario and then you move into the next one generally. Unlike the other two, with only one exception I've seen so far, Arkham Horror, you'll be on to the next scenario regardless of how the previous scenario went, and it's this fact that, in my opinion, makes Arkham Horror the strongest of the campaign structures. The campaign in this game feels more twisty than the other two, and it's those twists that I really think make this feel like a true campaign experience. Whereas you might stumble along the way, but the twists can give you different narrative text and even different ways to play some of the campaigns. For example, if you watched some of my playthroughs on the channel, you may have gotten different results if you were playing along with them. For instance, with the Night of the Zealot campaign, you might have ended up with a slightly different resolution in either of the scenarios, and as a result, the subsequent scenarios may have felt different. But anyway, I'm kind of rambling a little bit there. In this game, you really feel the impact and the results and decisions of your previous scenario. It's also not too hard to add a side story of some kind to your campaign to make the road even more twisty, or potentially just end the campaign on the spot depending on the results of that scenario. Some of the side stories might not work thematically, but it's easy enough to house rule them in. In fact, slight spoiler alert, one thing I like to do to make the side stories work a little better thematically is to add in some encounter sets from the main campaign. For instance, when I do a campaign of Dream Eaters, I can throw in a side story by incorporating some of the sets from the Dream Eaters campaign. So when I did my first playthrough of Dream Eaters, Murder of the Excelsior Hotel had come out at the same time, and I really wanted to do that as a side story. So what I did there was I inserted some of the sets from the Dream side into the encounter deck just to give it that little dream theme, if that makes sense. But anyway, normally doing those side stories can cost experience, but it's also easy enough to house rule, and when I do side stories on the channel, I won't be paying the experience for them. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is how the deck fits into this. So, you'll earn experience from each scenario, which you'll then use to upgrade your decks, again, within the deck building restrictions. You can also take additional experience when you go to build the initial deck at the start of the campaign, at a cost of 1 basic weakness per 10 experience you spend into the deck. Over the course of a campaign, The deck generally doesn't radically change unless you get a ton of experience to go in a radically different direction. That's the Arkham Horror campaign structure, so what about Lord of the Rings? The campaign to me feels a little more linear in Lord of the Rings, but unlike Arkham Horror, you have to win the first scenario before you move into the next one. That, to me, makes these campaigns feel like you're on a treadmill, especially if you run into a scenario that you just cannot get past. As I was playing this game solo, I was experiencing that with the first scenario of the campaign. Part of that might have been that I was using the suggested starter decks from the Learn to Play guide, but anyway, I really, or more that I might have been getting the feel for the game at the time, and I'm kind of still learning it at this point, although I don't think it's going to get to my table again. So I'm going to call this the treadmill experience, like I mentioned, where you have to beat the scenario before you move on to the next one. So you don't really feel the impact of any decisions here, and the narrative focus to me isn't really very strong in Lord of the Rings. It feels like one of those games where it wants to be a campaign, but you don't really get the twists and turns, I don't think, that you do with something like an Arkham Horror. But anyway, I don't really much care for that treadmill-esque experience. Anyway, once you get past a scenario, adding side stories into these campaigns is also probably easy enough. But I just got into this game with the core box, and I don't think I'm going to go any further with this game. But as for the deck, from what I'm seeing, there's potential for needing to radically change the deck between scenarios, which is also a cause for concern, especially if you get into that treadmill experience on a scenario where you've gotten used to playing the deck and you're like, okay, now I know when this comes up, this combo's together, that combo's together. I don't want to do this because that's a non-bo. It's basically like nothing I want to see. So if you need to change the deck radically, then all of a sudden you're right back to where you started from, where you're like, okay, I've got to learn how to play this together, or I've got to play that. So you kind of get stuck on the treadmill, whether because the scenario is difficult or you're trying to get used to how the deck works. But again, I don't really much care for that treadmill experience. But that's the campaign structure for Lord of the Rings. Last, how does the campaign structure work for Marvel Champions? Marvel Champions introduced the campaign system with the first expansion, The Rise of Red Skull. And similar to Lord of the Rings, you have to win each scenario before moving on to the next. As I mentioned when I was talking about the Lord of the Rings campaign structure, I don't care much for what I'm terming a treadmill campaign experience. Admittedly, I'm kind of experiencing that same thing with the Hero Realms background campaign, which is part of why I've made some of the house rules I have, so I can somewhat deal with that treadmill campaign experience. But anyway, as a result, and admittedly, this is coming from somebody who really likes campaign-based games, I think Marvel Champions works better if you play it as a one-shot, similar to something like a Sentinels of the Multiverse, without the environment setup. That being said, side stories are easy to add to the campaign in the form of scenario packs, and I'll mention these more when I talk about the additional products during ease of expansion. And the scenarios are easily customizable, given that you can mix up any of the encounter sets. Whereas I don't think the same thing works as well in Lord of the Rings, because from what I'm seeing in the base game, the scenarios there seem to really want the campaign structure. But I'm kind of rambling a little bit. So we have 2 linear campaign experiences and 1 twisty one. Last up, let's say you've bought your game and fallen in love with it, and now you want more in your game. How easy is each game to expand, and what's available for each game? We'll answer that question first for Arkham Horror. There are a lot of ways to expand your Arkham Horror experience. In fact, even getting into the game, assuming you have a group where someone else has the campaign, is as easy as just buying one of the Investigator's starter decks. It used to be very challenging to get additional content for this game, where you'd have to buy the deluxe expansions to get the first few scenarios for each campaign, and then buy the Mythos packs separately. And for everything between Forgotten Age and the Innsmouth Conspiracy, this would be how you'd have to buy everything for each campaign. Fantasy Flight is actually starting to re-release the older campaigns in a new model where they have all the player cards in one expansion and the campaigns separate. They actually started this model with the newest campaign, Edge of the Earth, and they just caught up to Path to Carcosa with the campaign expansion. So now Dunwich Legacy and Path to Carcosa both have the campaign and investigator expansions available for them. I actually briefly unboxed the Path to Carcosa investigator expansion. I'm not going to bother buying the campaign expansions, even though I really like the model, because it makes it a lot easier for people to get into the game now. Generally, the way I work with the reason I'm not going to bother with the campaign expansions for the older campaigns is because I already have all the campaigns when I bought the Mythos packs originally. So I essentially don't need to buy the campaign a second time, but I will always take additional player cards, because I can always use more of those for deck building options. But anyway, so I've alluded to the side stories a couple times in the video. This isn't the best example of a side story that you can add to a campaign, because this side scenario in particular requires you to build around specialized investigators, and I'm not going to crack that open. But generally, side stories are easy to add to a campaign that you can add as a side story in the middle of a campaign for usually a small experience cost of some kind, or play it as a standalone scenario as a one-shot. And the newer standalone scenarios are also increasingly being designed for what's called epic multiplayer mode, where you can have an entire event just dedicated to going after that scenario with a lot of people. Gen Con does this. I'm sure some of the other gaming conventions would do this. Arkham Knights definitely does this. And as a light spoiler note, I'm hoping to go to Arkham Knights if they have it later this year. But anyway, there are also return boxes, which I didn't have an example of a return box. Actually, I might have a return box. I'll be right back. Let me see if I can find one. So here's an example of one of the return boxes. Basically what these are, they add to the experience by giving you new player cards while also changing the campaign slightly. If you played any kind of MMORPG, think something similar to a hard mode of a dungeon. It's the exact same idea. Finally, there are the novellas, which are very hard to find with the player cards, which give a little bit of lore about the star character, along with player cards giving you alternate signature and weakness cards, which you can add to your deck. Anyway, that's Arkham Horror's expandability. As you can see, it's pretty easy to expand Arkham Horror. Now what about Lord of the Rings? Until earlier this year, I hadn't even really considered getting into the Lord of the Rings card game. It was only when the reprint was announced that I kind of warmed up to at least trying it, but again, I didn't really care much for Lord of the Rings. Anyway, there are more campaigns in this game, but most of them seem to be very hard to find. Fantasy Flight just finished reprinting the first campaign for that game in the same model as they're using with Edge of the Earth for Arkham Horror. But they also came out with starter decks that serve as a jump-in point for this game. I got two of them. I got the Elves and Dwarves decks, and I liked those decks, but I didn't really like the starter decks too much. And I just think there's too much with Lord of the Rings in terms of the game feels way too complicated. But anyway, there are also side stories and what are called nightmare packs for this game, which are basically hard modes for individual scenarios. Now, I reserve my right to change my opinion on how easy Lord of the Rings is to expand once more of the reprints take hold, but for now, I rank this game as the hardest to expand of the three. That's Lord of the Rings. Last, how easy is Marvel Champions to expand? Having not been around as long as the other two games, there isn't as much product available for Marvel Champions as there is for Arkham Horror or Lord of the Rings, but it's still decently easy to find. The hero packs make collecting everything slightly more patchwork than it is for Arkham Horror, but you can generally get your hands on everything relatively easily. You'll face a similar problem with the side scenarios, but that's pretty much a universal Fantasy Flight problem at this point. Barring any further new releases for either Marvel Champions or Arkham Horror, I'm currently caught up on both of those games, but new product has been announced for both of them. Also, we've got the Deluxe expansion, which give you everything for the respective campaign in them. But anyway, that's everything I wanted to talk about in this video. Now let's move back up top to talk about which game you should buy. So which game should you buy? If you buy based on theme, that's ultimately your call as to which theme appeals to you the most. In terms of the ability to expand, right now I don't think you want Lord of the Rings, since everything there is pretty hard to find at present time. But again, I reserve the right to change that opinion as more of the reprints take hold. If you're looking for something intricate with a deep narrative focus and a very twisty campaign, I think Arkham Horror is the game you want there. If you're looking for something simpler, I think you probably want Marvel Champions. As for the mechanics of the game, all three are somewhat similar on deck building, but the turns work very differently for each game, with Lord of the Rings being the most complicated of the three, and in my opinion, it isn't even close. But anyway, that will do it for this video. Before I leap into the outro, I wanted to update everyone on the move. Everything is moving smoothly on that front. I just signed the lease on Wednesday on the new apartment, and I'm starting to move my stuff in little by little. As for this week, I'm planning to make a few videos, so I don't know exactly what order everything will get uploaded in. Anyway, next week we'll start a space-themed month on the channel by jumping back into a very familiar deck builder. Next week, we're going to play Star Realms. Thank you for watching the video. Please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to turn on notifications so you get my content. Be well, stay safe, take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and I'll be back with more videos in the future. Until then, take care everyone.